My name is Margaret Cole, and the night my own son told me to get out of my kitchen, the stew on the stove was just beginning to thicken, filling the house with the smell of thyme and onions. I had stirred that stew the same way for decades, through storms and droughts, through the years after my husband died, through every night I waited for Ethan to come home from school, then college, then the city. It was the kind of routine that anchors a life. I never imagined it would also be the backdrop to the moment everything unraveled. Ethan stood by the counter with mud drying on his boots. The mud he hated so much, the mud he used to play in before he decided the ranch made him look small. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw tight, his eyes darting everywhere except at me. The kitchen light threw a pale gold across his face, sharpening every line of frustration. And for a second, he looked like a stranger standing in a place he didn't know how to love. We hadn't argued. Not really. I had only asked why he needed photos of the house, why he kept pacing around with his phone pressed to his ear, why he needed the deed transferred so quickly. Simple questions. A mother's questions. But he bristled, and then the bristle became anger. And the anger became something sharper and meaner than anything I had ever heard from him. "This isn't your house anymore, Mom," he snapped. "I'm tired of pretending you can keep running this place. I'm doing what makes sense. You need to start packing. I don't want to see you here when everything goes through." I felt the ladle slip from my hand and hit the floor, stew splattering across the tile. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. My heart thudded against my ribs, not from fear, but from the shock of realizing he meant every word. When I whispered, "What did you say?" he didn't soften. He didn't hesitate. "Get out," he said. "Get out of my house." And as I stared at him, my son, my only child, the truth washed over me with a cold clarity. That morning, I had signed the ranch over to him with my own hand. By nightfall, I knew I had made the worst mistake of my life. The morning had started so peacefully that it felt almost cruel in hindsight. The sky over Cedar Valley carried that soft lavender glow it gets right before sunrise, and the air coming through the kitchen window was cold enough to sting my cheeks. I poured my first cup of coffee and leaned on the counter, listening to the low rumble of the cows and the shuffle of the chickens waking in their coop. After 35 years on this land, those sounds were as familiar as my own heartbeat. I was reaching for the cream when I heard tires crunching up the gravel driveway. Out here, you can tell the difference between ranch tires and city tires long before the engine cuts. The ones rolling toward the house belonged to my son, and even before I saw his sedan crest the hill, something in me tightened. Ethan hadn't visited in months, but that morning he stepped out of the car like he owned the dawn. He smoothed the front of his pressed shirt, straightened his collar, and glanced at the barn as if trying not to breathe in too deeply. "Morning, Mom," he said when he came through the back door. "Big day, huh?" I handed him a mug and let him pour his own coffee. "It is," I said. "You drive safe coming up?" "Denver traffic at 7, he said with a shrug. "You know how it is." He sipped, winced, and added, "I forgot how strong your coffee is." "That's because it has flavor," I said, smiling. But he was already unlocking his phone, thumb flicking across emails, eyes narrowed in concentration. The glow from the screen washed out the warm light in the room, and I felt the first ripple of unease pass through me. When Caleb's truck rumbled into the yard, Ethan barely glanced toward the window. Caleb knocked once before stepping inside, hat in hand, the brim still frosted from the cold. He asked whether I wanted the grain stacked in the north shed like usual, and I told him yes. He nodded, greeted Ethan politely, and left to get started. As he walked away, I noticed Ethan watching him the way someone from the city watches a mechanic, appreciating the help but not wanting to get too close. "You know," Ethan said, sitting at the table, "when everything's official, we might streamline some of the expenses. You pay that kid too much for what he does." "He keeps this place running," I said. "That's worth more than you think." He didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. The silence sat between us like a stone. We drove into town mid-morning, heater humming, radio low. Ethan talked about office drama in a language I only half understood, analytics, conversions, client funnels. I nodded, letting the words wash over me. He had built a life where none of the skills I taught him seemed to matter anymore. Thomas Adler's office sits above the hardware store, just like it has since the 70s. When we walked in, the bell above the door chimed, and Thomas came out from behind a stack of folders with his tie loose and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "Morning, Margaret," he said warmly. "Morning, Ethan." He motioned us into the small conference room, where the deed sat waiting on the table. Seeing my name beside Ethan's on that paper made my throat tighten. I had told myself for months that this was the right thing, the natural passing of a family legacy. But in that moment, I felt a flicker of doubt. Thomas reviewed everything again, slower this time. The deed, the notarization, the cooling-off period I had asked for. 3 business days before recording. 3 days where the ranch was still legally mine. Ethan shifted in his chair. "I don't see why we need to wait," he said. "Mom's not going to change her mind." Thomas didn't respond, just watched me. He'd known me long enough to read the small tremors of uncertainty. I forced myself to smile, to push away the fear that kept brushing against the edge of my thoughts. "It's fine," I said. "Let's go ahead." I signed first. My hand shook, and the pen scratched slightly as it moved. When I slid it across to Ethan, he signed without even reading. The way you initial a delivery slip. Thomas gathered the papers, placed them carefully into a folder, and locked them in his cabinet. "That's that," he said. "Come Friday afternoon, the ranch will officially be yours." Ethan clapped a hand on my shoulder in a gesture that mimicked affection. "You won't regret this," he said with a grin. We left the office and crossed the street to the diner. The neon sign flickered above the door, and the smell of frying bacon wrapped around us like a warm blanket. Inside, Pam greeted me with a wave, brought my usual coffee without asking, and handed Ethan a menu. He ordered something light, checked his watch twice, and launched into talk about how owning property would help him pivot his future. When he mentioned refinancing the ranch, my fork paused halfway to my mouth. "Refinance?" I asked quietly. "Just to leverage it a little," he said. "You won't even notice." For the first time all morning, the air felt thin. Something inside me bent, not enough to break, but enough that I felt it. When we drove back to the ranch, Ethan asked me to slow down near the road so he could take pictures of the house. "For insurance," he said. But as he walked ahead of me with his phone lifted toward the porch, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that he wasn't capturing memories. He was scouting. By late afternoon, the winter light had thinned into a pale ribbon across the fields, the kind that fades before you're ready for it. I was in the kitchen chopping carrots when I heard Ethan's voice outside, sharp and quick, the tone he used when he thought he was impressing someone on the other end of a call. The screen door creaked as I stepped closer, and through the glass I saw him pacing the porch with his phone pressed tight to his ear. "Yeah, I'm here now," he said, glancing at the pasture as if assessing inventory. "It's in good shape. We could probably list it around $850, maybe higher if the market stays hot. My name goes on the deed this week, so we should move fast." I froze. The knife hovered above the cutting board. He paused to listen, then laughed a low, confident laugh I didn't recognize. "No, she won't be an issue," he said. "I'll get her settled in town. She doesn't need this place. She's barely keeping it together as it is." My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I stepped away from the window, needing something solid to hold on to. I gripped the edge of the counter, breathing slow, reminding myself not to jump to conclusions. But the words clung to me like burrs on a coat, barely keeping it together. Doesn't need this place. When he came inside, he didn't notice the way I watched him. He tossed his jacket on the chair, opened his laptop on the kitchen table, and started comparing mortgage rates like he owned every inch of the land beneath his feet. The stew simmered behind me, filling the room with warmth, but the air between us felt cold. "Ethan," I said quietly, "why were you talking about listing the ranch?" He didn't look up. "I told you at lunch. There are options. Selling might be one of them." "I thought the ranch meant something to you," I said, "even if you didn't want to live here." "It does mean something," he said, finally glancing at me. "It means opportunity." "Opportunity for what?" "To actually build a future," he snapped. "Mom, come on. You don't seriously think I'm going to spend my life babysitting a dying piece of land when I could turn it into real capital?" He shut his laptop with a loud click and stood up as if my presence irritated him. "You raised me to be practical," he said. "Well, I'm being practical. You can't keep up with this place. You know that. It's time to move on." I stared at him, searching his face for the boy who once ran barefoot through these halls, who built forts out of hay bales and brought me wildflowers with roots still attached. But all I saw was a man in a hurry to discard the life that made him. "Move on where?" I asked. "I found an apartment complex in town," he said. "One-bedroom units, elevator, easy access to everything. You'll be comfortable there." "You've already looked at apartments?" My voice cracked before I could stop it. "Of course I have. You think I'd start this process without a plan?" I stepped closer, feeling something rise in me, confusion, hurt, maybe even fear. "Ethan, this is my home." "It was your home," he corrected, and there was no hesitation in it. "By Friday, it'll be mine. And I'm not going to let this place sink me financially. I need to think long term." He brushed past me toward the hallway. I reached for his arm, not to stop him, just to slow the spiral we were in. "Ethan, wait. Can we talk about this? Please." He jerked away like my touch burned. "This isn't up for debate." The room went still. Even the simmering pot felt muted, distant. He walked back toward the table, the soles of his boots leaving small dust prints across the wood floor. When he turned around, his face was pinched with frustration, something darker pooling beneath it. "I don't want to argue," he said. "I'm tired, I'm stressed, and I'm sick of being treated like I don't know what I'm doing." "I never said you didn't," I whispered. "You didn't have to. This whole passive-aggressive routine, acting surprised, asking questions you already know the answers to, just stop." He took a breath, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and when he spoke again, his voice was colder. "Look, it'll be easier for both of us if you start packing. I want this transition clean." A chill swept through me. "Transition?" I repeated. He exhaled sharply. "God, Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You can't stay here." My pulse hammered. "What do you mean I can't stay here?" He glared, jaw tightening. "I mean get out. Get out of my house." The words hit harder than any physical blow. For a second, the edges of my vision blurred, and the kitchen, the one space in the world that had always felt safe, suddenly felt unfamiliar. I bent to pick up the towel near the stove, more to keep my hands from shaking than anything else. When I stood up again, he was already walking toward the front door, muttering about calls he needed to make. He left the door open behind him. The cold swept in, raising goosebumps along my arms. I stood alone in the kitchen, stew bubbling softly as if nothing had happened, and I felt the last of my certainty slip away. The papers were signed, the transfer was in motion, and my son, my only child, had just cut me out of the life I'd built. But that night, standing in the broken quiet of my own home, something new flickered inside me. Not anger, not grief, clarity. The next morning arrived colder than any forecast had warned. Frost had crept up the windows overnight, and when I touched the glass above the sink, it bit at my fingertips. I barely slept, and the few times I drifted off, I kept hearing Ethan's voice echoing in the dark. Get out. Get out of my house. Each time, it jolted me awake. I wrapped my robe tighter around me and made coffee, though the smell alone churned my stomach. Outside, the world looked washed clean, the kind of morning that usually settled my nerves. But nothing settled today. I kept replaying the scene in the kitchen, his tone, the way he spoke about me as though I were a burden he couldn't wait to shed. By 8 o'clock, I couldn't pretend things would simply blow over. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and reached for the phone. My fingers hovered above the screen for a long moment before I tapped Thomas Adler's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and steady, a sound that had anchored me through years of paperwork and legal hurdles. Margaret, everything all right? No, I said. Not really. I took a breath, steadying the tremble. Thomas, I need to know if the deed has been recorded yet. There was a pause, the kind that swells with possibility. No, he said slowly. It won't be sent to the county office until tomorrow afternoon. That's still within the window. Why do you ask? I closed my eyes. I want to cancel the transfer. Another long pause. Papers rustled on his end, and I pictured him pushing aside folders, leaning forward in that old wooden chair of his. Are you sure? He asked. I'm sure. All right, he said, voice firm now. Come in this morning. We'll draft a revocation document. Since the transfer isn't complete, you're fully within your rights. The relief that washed over me wasn't joy. It was steadiness, like setting both feet back on solid ground after stumbling. I grabbed my keys, drove into town, and tried not to think about how easily I had almost handed away everything I had ever built. Thomas met me at the door with a sympathetic frown. He didn't ask for details, but I could tell he sensed them in the tightness of my shoulders. I signed the revocation with a steadier hand than I'd had the day before. He made copies, slipped one into a sealed envelope, and handed it to me. You did what you felt was right yesterday, he said gently, and you're doing what's right today. I thanked him and drove home. Though my hands tightened around the steering wheel as I turned up the driveway, Ethan's car was already there. My breath caught. He must have left Denver early. He came out onto the porch before I even closed my truck door. His expression was tight, anxious rather than angry. Mom, I need the updated paperwork, he said quickly. The potential buyer wants confirmation everything's on track. I walked past him and into the house, hanging my coat on the hook by the door. He followed close behind, the urgency in his steps rattling the quiet of the living room. Mom, did you hear me? I did, I said, taking the envelope from my purse. And this is the only paperwork you'll be getting. He snatched it out of my hand, tearing the flap open. I watched his face change color as his eyes darted across the page. Confusion came first, then denial, then something sharper. What is this? He demanded. It's a revocation, I said calmly. I canceled the transfer. You canceled, Mom. You can't do that. His voice cracked on the last word. We signed the deed. It's done. It's not done until it's recorded, I said, and it wasn't recorded. He paced the room, running a hand through his hair. Do you have any idea what you've just done? I've already made commitments. I've taken a deposit. I told people. That, I interrupted softly, was your mistake, not mine. He rounded on me, eyes wild. You're sabotaging me. Why would you do this? Because I was honest with you? Because I told you the truth about the ranch? No, I said. Because you told me to get out of my own home. The words hung between us like smoke, dense and undeniable. He flinched, just barely, but his pride rushed in to cover the wound. This isn't over, he said. I'll get a lawyer. Then get one, I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. I'm done letting you dictate my future. He left without slamming the door. Somehow that was worse. The quiet he left behind felt hollow, but for the first time in a long time, the hollowness held space for something else. Strength. That afternoon, a young woman knocked on my door, introducing herself as Claire Dawson, Ethan's attorney. She was polite, professional, and far too competent to be dragged into my son's bad decisions. After reviewing the revocation, she sighed and turned to Ethan, who stood behind her looking pale and furious. She's within her rights, Claire said gently. There's no case here. Ethan's shoulders sagged. Rage, disbelief, humiliation, they all flickered across his face. I watched them all without speaking. When they left, I stood on the porch, the cold wind cutting across the yard, and I knew nothing would ever go back to the way it was. But maybe that wasn't a loss. Maybe, for the first time, it was a beginning. The weeks that followed moved the way winter storms do out here, slow to arrive, but merciless once they settle in. Ethan stopped calling after Claire told him the truth, and the silence should have felt like relief. Instead, it sat on my shoulders like a heavy coat I hadn't chosen. I went back to my chores, repaired a fence line with Caleb, sold eggs to neighbors, did all the things that made up the rhythm of my life. But even in the familiar hum of the ranch, I felt the bruise of what had happened, a quiet ache that didn't quite fade. Word spread through town faster than I expected. Cedar Valley is small, and people notice when a grown son storms out of his mother's house looking like he swallowed fire. Nancy Miller stopped by one afternoon with a pie she pretended she accidentally made too much of, and when I told her everything, she put her hand over mine and said, "You protected what's yours. That's not cruelty. That's survival." Her voice cracked just enough to tell me she'd carried her own wounds once. Then, one gray evening, about 3 months later, a car I didn't recognize crawled up the driveway. I stepped onto the porch, wiping my hands on a dish towel. Ethan climbed out slowly, thinner than before, his clothes hanging wrong, his eyes hollowed out. The pride was still there, but dented, softened, almost bruised. "Mom," he said, voice hoarse, I don't have anywhere else to go." He came closer, stopping at the bottom step like the house itself was drawing a line he wasn't sure he could cross. He told me about losing his job, the lawsuit over the deposit, the friends who'd stopped returning his calls, and then his voice broke completely as he whispered, "I messed everything up. Please, let me stay. I'll work the ranch. I'll sleep in the barn. I don't want to be alone." There was a time, not long ago, when I would have rushed down those steps and pulled him into my arms, but something in me had changed the night he told me to get out. Not hardness, not spite, just understanding. "You're not alone," I said gently, "but you can't stay here." He stared at me, eyes shining with disbelief, then grief. I handed him a small envelope, $200, the last bit of help I was willing to give. "Use it to find your footing," I said. "The rest is up to you." As he drove away, Disappearing down the curve of the road, the wind lifted across the pasture, carrying a strange combination of sorrow and peace. For the first time in years, the ranch felt entirely mine again, and I finally understood that protecting a home sometimes means closing a door.